Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics, and with Boris Johnson's large majority in the House of Commons, not only is his withdrawal bill sailing through the House of Commons, but he's even amending it at will with features that remove even more of our rights. And what's more, all of this is happening without even the usual scrutiny that should accompany major legislation. But when a bill clears the Commons, it heads off to the House of Lords for further scrutiny that cannot be blocked by Johnson. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing the strange situation whereby the general election has actually resulted in less power for the democratically elected MPs, and whether or not the unelected Lords will smooth out the rougher edges of Johnson's bill. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and political commentary, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, earlier this week, there was a very interesting Institute for Government discussion. The panel consisted of a couple of peers, as well as a Conservative MP, Stephen Crabb, and an SNP MP, Joanna Cherry, who you may know from the court cases last year. Naturally, you are not going to get the full, unvarnished, objective truth from MPs, without accusing them of lying as such. They are party beat and they have a party line to toe. But Stephen Crabb, the Conservative MP, did say something extremely interesting when asked about the resistance that Boris Johnson could face over some of his Brexit plans. He noted that Parliament was a very different beast to that before the election, and not just in terms of the parliamentary arithmetic. Of course, Boris Johnson now has a huge majority. He can actually afford a few rebels and still get things through, but he's not actually got any rebels. There's no appetite for rebellion there. And that's because it's the actual personnel that's changed, not just the numbers, particularly on the government benches. A lot of the old guard who were resisting Brexit, or certainly the Conservatives' hard Brexit, such as Dominic Grieve, have gone. And in their place are lots of completely new MPs. He described, amongst other things, a usual thing about, having to find their way around the Palace of Westminster, not knowing the way to things. That's understandable, yeah. But he also described how these people were confused when MPs were getting to their feet during questions like, what are they doing this for? And I'm thinking, hang on a minute. That took me a little bit by surprise because, yeah, I'd fully understand that MPs will have a lot of procedures to get to grips with. In Parliament, tradition reigns supreme, and so, the way things work doesn't always make common sense. It's certainly not a modern system. But what he was describing there were MPs who didn't even know the basics of how parliamentary debates work. The sort of things that you would become familiar with, as indeed I have, simply by watching Parliament at work on the television. You would think that budding MPs would have at least done that. Put simply, these MPs are incapable of doing anything, whether for their constituents or for the country. They're incapable of doing anything right now in Parliament. They don't know what they're doing. They were unlikely to be difficult with Boris Johnson anyway, because they're new MPs. They won't have the confidence to rock the boat. But they don't even have the understanding of how to get anything done in Parliament right now. They'll sit down when they're told to, be guided by the whips into walking through the right door to vote without ever having any idea what they're voting for. Some of them may be interested enough to read up on it. Some of them will just think, well, what's the point? I'm going to be told which way to vote anyway. So there is no scrutiny or opposition to any of Boris Johnson's amendments to the Brexit bill to come from the elected House of Commons. This includes amendments that either weren't mentioned or run counter to what was promised in the election campaign. We're not talking about things that Boris Johnson promised to do during the election and is now going to do, claiming the mandate that he's got with his majority. So it is now down to the House of Lords to see what it can do. And make no mistake, the majority of the House of Lords are absolutely appalled by this proposed legislation. But they also know it's not their job to block legislation that was promised in a general election and for which the party that promised it has won a majority. That's not what they do. Brexit will happen. They will not seek to block that. But, as I noted, there are things in the bill that were not part of the election campaign and for which there is no evidence that there is any public desire to see enacted. These elements could absolutely face changes. The House of Lords has the power to amend any legislation or any bill that passes through it. Yes, the Commons, as the elected body, can if needs be, if there's a real logjam, it can force through legislation, any legislation that it wants. The idea is, a bill passes through the Commons and 3 times various amendments go on, then it goes to the House of Lords. Similar process there, debates and amendments and so on, and then it goes back to the House of Commons. If the House of Commons is happy with it all, and it is very common for the Lords to amend it, and usually the Commons go, yeah, that's fine, we're okay with that, and they pass it through and it becomes law. But if they're not, if the Commons, in this particular case the government, is not at all happy with the amendments that the Lords have pushed through, then they can force it through. But this is not a quick process. In fact, it takes 6 months. Now, were that to happen, that would mean we would not be leaving the EU on January the 31st. Boris Johnson has promised we'll be leaving the EU on January the 31st. And okay, yeah, he could go and blame the House of Lords if he wanted, but still people will look at the situation and go like, hang on, you promised and you have a whacking great majority. What's the dealio? And this, because although Boris Johnson can bully his way through the Commons, he can get anything through the Commons right now, as has been demonstrated this week with some of the most terrible legislation that doesn't even do him any good. I think it was just done just to flex his muscles now that he's got this majority. Because he knew he was completely stuck. He was trapped in a corner last Parliament. The opposition parties absolutely had him over a barrel, nothing he could do about it. And then they just let him go. And I think he's just now out to just demonstrate the power he now has. But although he can bully his way through the Commons, he is going to have to be more reasonable with the Lords. He cannot bully his way through the Lords. And this irony was not lost on Joanna Cherry, the SNP MP, who, earlier this week, she noted with that, she said, this is no disrespect to the Lords, but we've now got a situation where unelected peers have more power to scrutinise legislation than the elected members of the Commons. And not because the Lords have more power, but because MPs have less as a result of Boris Johnson's refusal to respect the rules. Essentially, British parliamentary democracy works largely on conventions, that politicians have in the past respected. Boris Johnson does not respect them, and because the conventions, a lot of them at any rate, are not legally binding rules, the democratic system is weakened. And I know some people will say at this point, well, this is why you need the written constitution. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not so sure. Bear in mind that the United States has a written constitution, and that hasn't stopped Trump also doing the same thing in ignoring conventions that they have that other presidents were respecting beforehand. But the point is that Boris Johnson has little power in the Lords, and peers don't face deselection. So as such, even the ones who are members of parties are able to behave honestly and for the genuine good of whomever they wish to represent. They don't all wish to represent the British people, but thank goodness the vast majority of them do, and they genuinely act in the best interest of what they believe is best for the country and best for its people. So despite Johnson warning the Lords not to block what he's calling the people's will, he may have to compromise in a few areas in order to get his precious Brexit this month. After all, he can argue that the general election was a mandate from the people, but the Lords are no fools. They know that more people voted for parties who were promising another referendum. They know that if you're just going to look at the number of people who voted, the majority of people did not vote for Brexit, and they certainly did not vote for his Brexit. His people's will Brexit is a fallacy that fools nobody paying attention to politics. And the Lords, of course, can vote through any amendments they like. Absolutely any they like. And the only way that this bill is going to become law this month is when it returns to the Commons if Boris Johnson accepts them. All of them. So he has a choice. He can work with the different groups in the House of Lords to influence which parts of the bill remain intact. He can do that. They will be amenable to that. They know that this is going to happen. They genuinely have no desire to block Brexit now because they know that, the general election results are as they are. They just wish to change some of the more terrible amendments that have been added since the general election that had nothing to do with the general election campaign. And if Boris Johnson is reasonable about that and discusses and negotiates, then he will be able to get his bill back and through and on the statute books in a form that does what he originally set out to do and what he promised the people he would do. Or he can continue to be obstinate and lose complete control of the process. Stephen Crabb, the Conservative MP that was on the Institute for Government panel that I was talking about, was suggesting that Boris Johnson would be more open to negotiating a compromise with the Lords and that he does expect a few agreed changes. But what I'd be quite sure of is that there are going to be changes made to it. It really is just a case of, does Boris Johnson approach the Lords in a reasonable manner, in which case he will still have control over the process, because they will be reasonable, very genuinely, even though they know this legislation is pretty bad, because there's form for this, there is form for this. Or is he going to continue to rail against them, in which case he has a choice. He's going to have to accept a load of amendments that he really genuinely doesn't want, not just the few horrible things he was throwing in to flex his muscles. Or he risks having to wait another 6 months to railroad it through, which he could do, but then that means we have to ask for another extension. And he doesn't just get to photocopy a letter this time, he will actually have to write for an extension and delay his Brexit by another 6 months. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.